Some chapters in human history do not offer comfort or pride. They demand honesty. They force us to look into the depths of what our species is capable of, both in cruelty and in resilience. These are the stories that are not just uncomfortable. They are necessary. The Atlantic slave trade is one such story. It is not a footnote. It is a foundational pillar of the modern world. Its legacy is written into the economies of nations, the cultures of continents, and the DNA of millions. And yet, how much do we truly understand about what happened? How often do we stop to ask, who were the people taken? What were their lives like before? What happened when their worlds were torn apart? Let's find out. The story begins in the 15th century, a time when European powers were expanding their reach across the globe. The Age of Exploration, as it's often called, was also the age of conquest, colonization, and exploitation. The Portuguese were among the first to chart the West African coastline, soon followed by the Spanish, Dutch, British, and French. At first, their interest was in trade: gold, spices, ivory. But as sugar plantations grew in the Americas, so did the demand for labor. Indigenous populations, already decimated by disease and violence, could not meet the need. European colonizers turned to Africa. But why Africa? Why did they choose to rip entire populations from their homes, families, cultures, and continents? The answer lies in a grim convergence of economics, ideology, and power. Africa was vast, rich in resources and people. European traders found that they could acquire captives through alliances with African rulers, raids, or direct force, and sell them at massive profit in the Americas. Slavery was not new to the world, but the Atlantic slave trade was unique in its scale, brutality, and the invention of racial slavery. For the first time, slavery was based not on war, crime, or debt, but on skin color and a twisted notion of racial inferiority. How does a society come to believe that an entire race is less than human? How were Christian monarchies able to reconcile faith with forced bondage? Over the course of more than 400 years, it's estimated that over 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Some scholars suggest even more, when accounting for those who died before boarding the ships. The trade operated through a system known as the triangular trade. European merchants shipped goods, textiles, firearms, alcohol, to Africa, where they exchanged them for human lives. Those lives were packed onto ships and sent across the ocean in a journey known as the Middle Passage. This name sounds neutral, geographic even, but in reality it refers to one of the most horrific experiences in human history. The Middle Passage was a floating graveyard. Conditions aboard slave ships were beyond inhumane. People were chained together, stacked like cargo, deprived of light, air, food, and dignity. Illnesses such as dysentery, smallpox, and scurvy ran rampant. Women were particularly vulnerable, often subjected to sexual violence from the crew. Children cried until they had no tears left. The dead were tossed overboard, sometimes by the dozens. Others, gripped by despair, threw themselves into the sea. Some refused to eat, preferring death over enslavement. Can we even begin to comprehend what it means to lose your freedom, your language, your identity, while confined in darkness, thousands of miles from everything you've ever known? Those who survived the passage arrived in the Americas only to face more horror. Upon landing, they were auctioned off like livestock, examined, prodded, and priced. Families were split apart. Husbands taken from wives, children wrenched from mothers, and their new lives? A cycle of endless labor, violence, and dehumanization. Slavery powered the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, The rice fields of the Carolinas, the cotton plantations of the Deep South, and the gold mines of Brazil. The enslaved worked from dawn to dusk, under scorching heat and the constant threat of punishment. Whippings, mutilation, branding, and executions were routine tools of control. And yet, amidst the brutality, enslaved people found ways to resist, through culture, through sabotage, through survival. They kept alive songs from their homeland, adapted spiritual beliefs, and told stories that passed down fragments of lost languages. They found strength in each other, in kinship, in faith, and in hope. Some ran away and formed maroon communities, hidden enclaves of escaped slaves who lived free in mountains and swamps. Some rebelled outright, like those aboard the slave ship Amistad, or in uprisings like the 1811 German Coast Rebellion in Louisiana. The most successful revolt of all came in Haiti, where enslaved Africans overthrew their French colonizers and declared independence in 1804. How do we not speak of these heroes with the same reverence as we do revolutionaries in Europe and America? How different would the world look if we centered their stories in our histories? As the centuries turned, opposition to slavery grew. In Britain, figures like William Wilberforce led abolitionist campaigns. In the U.S., freedmen and women, along with white allies, published newspapers, wrote books, and formed societies demanding the end of slavery. In 1807, the British Parliament outlawed the slave trade, and in 1833, it abolished slavery throughout the British Empire. The U.S. banned the trade in 1808, though illegal smuggling continued. Slavery itself would not end in the United States until 1865, and in Brazil not until 1888, the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish it. But what happened next? Did freedom mean justice? Did freedom mean equality? Unfortunately, abolition did not bring an end to oppression. Formerly enslaved people entered societies that were still deeply hostile to their existence. They faced segregation, disenfranchisement, poverty, and violence. In the United States, Jim Crow laws ensured that black people remained second-class citizens for nearly a century after emancipation. In the Caribbean and South America, colonial hierarchies and colorism continued to marginalize Afro-descended populations. Around the world, the scars of slavery endured, not just in law, but in the hearts and minds of people shaped by centuries of racist ideology. Even today, the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade is visible. It lives in systemic racism, in wealth disparities, in underfunded schools and over-policed neighborhoods. It lives in the silence around black contributions to history. It lives in trauma passed down through generations. But it also lives in resilience. It lives in spirituals and blues, in gospel and reggae, in samba and hip-hop. It lives in the traditions, food, language, and pride of people across the African diaspora. It lives in movements for justice, in voices demanding reparations, in students uncovering the hidden histories of their ancestors. Isn't that also a form of resistance? Isn't memory itself an act of defiance? To remember the Atlantic slave trade is not to dwell in guilt, it is to choose truth. It is to acknowledge that empires were built on bones, and that modern wealth often has its roots in ancient pain. It is to honor those who were lost, to elevate those who survived, and to empower those who carry the legacy forward. If we don't tell these stories, fully, truthfully, and loudly, how can healing ever begin? So what now? How do we move forward? We begin by remembering, by teaching, by listening, by amplifying the voices that were once silenced. We ask hard questions. We accept uncomfortable answers. We push for change. not just in books and museums, but in policies, in reparations, in how we view one another. We stop pretending that history lives only in the past, because the past is still with us. The past is present, and only when we face it can we finally begin to build something better.